So welcome. Yes, I'm Linda. I think most of you know. Welcome to the next Anabaptist Theology Forum. I'm very pleased to have Ian Randall coming to talk this evening, present. We'll probably not have breakout rooms. We'll probably, after Ian's given his presentation, given the numbers and so on, we'll probably just have a discussion, which when we get to that stage, I'll explain how we'll do it. I've known Ian since he and I were PhD students together with the same supervisor in the 1990s, both doing 19th century history. And since then, he's done many things, including written a prolific number of books, one of which was on the Bruderhof in Britain. And some of you might remember he gave the Centre of Anabaptist Studies lecture on that in 2017. He's a research associate at Cambridge Centre for Christianity Worldwide and also works within the Cambridge Theological Federation. And he's still a senior research fellow at Spurgeon's and IBTSC in Amsterdam. So doing various things in what I think counts as being retired. But this current paper, and I haven't got the title in front of me, is, oh yes, Robert Robinson, 1735 to 1790, a pioneer of dissent in Cambridge. So over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. And that's a nice memory about our shared supervisor, David Bebbington, from whom I learned a very great deal. So I'm really pleased to be sharing in this evening, and thank you for the invitation. My own involvement with Janice, my wife, in the Anabaptist tradition really began in the 1970s and included visits to the London Mennonite Centre and friendship with Alan and Ellie Crider. And then in the 1990s, at the beginning of the 1990s, Stuart and I were colleagues at Spurgeon's College and developed Anabaptist studies there. And later I took the courses to a European Baptist college in Prague, which served right across Europe. And we were there for some years, Janice and I. And as you say, Linda, more recently we've spent time at Bruderhof communities in England and Germany and the USA, which was part of the exploration to write about their history. So that's just a little bit, and when we come to discussion, we might want to go beyond Robert Robinson to other topics, of course. But for my paper on Robert Robinson, and a pioneer of dissent in Cambridge in the sense that he was the first to build up a significant dissenting congregation in the town, now a city, but then town. The congregation, which became St. Andrew Street Baptist Church, met in the Stone Yard, quite centrally in Cambridge. And during Robinson's time, it grew from a small group to become the largest congregation in the town, with about 800 people. And they've preserved really extensive records of the church, well looked after. And these are the records that I've used. The dissenters, just in case we need to say a word or two about them, were those who refused to worship according to the, I'm just changing my screen here, refused to worship according to the dictates of the established Church of England. And dissenters were limited in their involvement in society in the 18th century and earlier and even later because of legislation such as the Test and Corporation Acts, which meant they couldn't normally hold public office, as this was largely limited to Church of England communicants, and there were other restrictions. So that's where the dissenting part comes from. And among what we will see were his many activities, Robinson wrote on the Anabaptists. So this is where I think it connects somewhat with our own interests. And he said, I quote here, that it was Anabaptistical, a little bit of a mouthful, Anabaptistical and also biblical, to hold that the church ought to be constituted of believers only, and that ministers of the word should be believers in the truths they preached. That might seem rather obvious that they should be believers, but he was talking against a background where in the established church, you could just be a career person as a clergyman. And so that's the point he was making. He believed also that in this tradition, the whole community of the faithful, as he put it, had the power of electing their pastor. So this is very much where he saw himself as both Anabaptistical and in the Baptist community of his time, to elect the pastor. And he also spoke about excluding the magistrate from the exercise of any civil power in the church. This, of course, also goes back to the Anabaptists. So these were some of the principles that motivated him. And he was really a shaping figure. His ideas were then rehearsed, and I've gone through later records of St. Andrew Street Church, where they state that the church should consist of real Christians with its life based on agreement to the essential doctrines of the gospel and evidence of personal piety and holiness. Members held to the right, I'm quoting from some of their later statements, members hold to the right of private judgment in interpreting scripture, to liberty of conscience, and to Christ alone as the head of the church. The scriptures were the rule of faith and practice. And again, they objected to several aspects of the Church of England, including the supremacy of the king or queen over the established church, the support of religion being enforced by the civil power, patrons who choose ministers, that is, patrons of parishes, and the lack of scriptural discipline, as they put it. So I just want to make a little comment here that for those of us who are interested in the Anabaptist tradition, and I'm deeply interested in it, I suggest that it's not always helpful, as sometimes happens, where we jump from the great age of Anabaptism of the 16th century up to today, as if there are not really very significant things happening in between. Of course, the Mennonite tradition continued right through, although not to any extent in Britain. But there were radical dissenters who really inherited something of the Anabaptist vision. And that's a particular interest of mine. So now to just say where we're going with this, I'm going to look a little bit at Robinson's early life, then the beginnings of his ministry, the growth of the church in Cambridge, his particular vision of his role as a pastor and teacher, some of what he said about the Anabaptists, and then finally Robinson as a campaigner, as a political campaigner primarily. So he was born in Norfolk. His mother was Mary Robinson. That was her married name. Her father was very wealthy, but when he died, he left all his money to the woman he was living with, and no money came to his daughter, Mary. In the meantime, Mary had made a bad marriage to a Michael Robinson, who treated her cruelly and later left her. So Mary brought up 3 children as a single parent. The whole of this story sounds rather contemporary to me. Mum realized that Robert was unusually gifted. I've seen a reference to him having learned Latin at the age of 5.5. That seems a little bit ambitious, but he was certainly very gifted in languages, in a range of languages, and in literature. And Mary recognized this as mum and worked very hard by sewing and keeping lodgers to try to give him some extra education, which she could see he would make good use of. However, the attempt to do this and to support also his brother and sister, that was beyond Mary's means. So Robert, here we're talking about him as a teenager, moved to London to be an apprentice, first of all to a hairdresser and then a butcher. He was trying to teach himself at the same time, but his only religious contact was at some distance with the Church of England. and he was actually contemptuous when he heard that the Methodists were gaining converts, and this was the time of the evangelical revival. So by the time he was 18, he was part of a group of young men that he enjoyed, and he was always a very sociable person, enjoyed going around with, looking for amusement, but certainly not really with any kind of religious surge in mind. However, he decided to go and hear a leading preacher in the evangelical revival, George Whitefield, and he recounts how, first of all, he thought that these were poor, deluded Methodists that he was going to encounter, but he says he came away envying their happiness, and that's quite a telling kind of description of what was going on in the 18th century evangelical revival. People were attracted by this vibrancy and changed lives. And actually, he weighed up the message for 3 years, quite a significant time in a young life, as to whether it was true and whether it was real, and a great deal of what we would call inner turmoil, really. But on the 24th of May, 1752, he experienced evangelical conversion. And after this, still in London, he made sure that he heard different preachers, John Wesley and other well-known Methodists, and also some Baptists, although not many. He called Whitefield his much honored father in Christ. So I think all through his life, he saw that this had been a major turning point that had come through Whitefield. So that's just a little bit about the early life. Now I'll go on to beginnings in ministry. So we're still talking about his very early Christian experience, and he moved back to Norfolk to live and work with some relatives on a farm, and he retained a lifelong interest in farming. He began preaching among the local Methodists in Norfolk and in Suffolk, and was invited to preach at the Methodist Tabernacle in Norwich. That sounds like a very impressive place. It was actually a fairly small congregation, but they used the word tabernacle. And Whitefield was encouraging him about his ministry, and we know that from a letter that Whitefield wrote. However, Robinson was not destined to stay with the Methodists. He found out more about believers' baptism and was convinced that this was what was taught in the scriptures. And so he was baptized as an adult believer. And soon the Baptists who got to know him were struck by his unusual ability, and this ability was always evident to anyone really who met him. And it was in 1759, at the age of 23, that he began to preach to the small Baptist group in Cambridge, the Stoneyard congregation that I mentioned before. The previous pastor of this Cambridge congregation in the Stoneyard was a Scot, George Simpson, who was a high Calvinist, if you understand that, in the sense that he was very wary of evangelistic outreach. And I'm sorry to say, as a Scot, that this brother, George Simpson, had a violent temper, and the congregation, we read, became soured and disunited, and it really went downhill. But after Robinson started to preach, more people came, and he preached for 2 years, in which the members were saying to him, "Will you be our pastor?" And he was really hesitant. He was young, and he had never been to college training. He was self-taught. But in 1761, so after 2 years of preaching, he finally accepted a call to be the pastor. And he wrote later of how the members tenderly loved him. And I think there's something about some of what was lacking in his own earlier life that he just found within this community of believers. He also talks with his wife Ellen about finding fathers and brothers and sisters within this congregation. And his description of his role as minister was that he was, I quote, "the free minister of a free people." And this was, of course, in part a reference to the Church of England's way of being in ministry. And he talked about them being in covenant. This was a very typical Baptist way of speaking about a church members, church congregation, being in covenant together to walk, I'm still quoting, in faithfulness, forbearance, and tenderness to each other. So it wasn't a forced thing for Robinson. It was always something that sprang out of love for each other and obviously love for Christ. We know a fair amount about Robinson's family life. It is clear that he was attentive and affectionate towards his wife, and as the family expanded, he was a dedicated father. He believed children needed to discover their beliefs for themselves. He believed in an open home, and several needy people were taken in at various times into his home. Some perhaps inevitably abused his kindness. When people came to visit the home, or he went to visit others and met up with them, he was known as a very good companion. He could tell stories, he was entertaining, and he was a good listener. So I hope that as we've come to this point of Robinson, you can get a little bit of a feel, and I'll just pop this up here, which perhaps doesn't tell us all that much about him, but that's him anyway. Perhaps what I've said would make us think that he was always just nice about everybody and nice to everybody. He could also be quite robust. There's what I think is an interesting incident. Perhaps some of you will know the name Charles Simeon, who was the vicar of Holy Trinity Church in Cambridge and was a major leader in an evangelical movement in the Church of England. And at one point, there's more detail that I'm not necessarily going into, or could go into if you want, but Simeon came round to Robinson's church after a service, and the churches are quite near one another, and talked about a problem he had with the bishop. And he was hoping that Robinson would give him some sympathetic support, but all that Robinson said was, if you want to get rid of that problem, become a dissenter, and then you won't have the bishop on your back anymore. So that's just an example of, which comes out in some other ways, of him able to speak quite plainly when he felt that was what was needed. So now I'll talk a little bit about the growth of the congregation, because this is quite important to see how it grew and to what extent it grew. So the church membership records show that when he came to the congregation, it was 34 people in number. But after about a decade and a half, they had to build a new building because the numbers had grown so much, and we're up to 600 to 800 people. So part of this is just the dynamic of his preaching, but also I think the care that was shown by the congregation to many new Christians who had come along. And the wealthy members certainly helped with this new building that was built. The old building was described as damp and cold, but this was a good building that was built. And you can see that Robinson was very aware that the wealthier members who helped to build the building could have undue influence in the congregation. And he always wanted to resist that. He wanted to hear from the people who were, if you like, at the bottom of the social and economic scale just as much. That's really important when we come to link his views of the church with his views of society. The congregation certainly became known for the way it reached out to the poor and catered for needs, and part of the deacons' responsibility in the church was to care for those in need. And you can see some of the records of Robinson himself visiting people and finding out their situation and what could be done to help. We actually have, quite fairly unusually for some of the church records, we have lists of the occupations of the members. And the largest group despite the fact that I'm going to go on to say that he influenced the university, the largest group by occupation were laborers. So these were unskilled laborers who were the largest group. Others were skilled workers, and the lists show carpenters and shoemakers and glovers, others as well, and farmers were well represented, and Robinson had various pieces of advice as to how to farm well. I don't think that all the advice he gave was necessarily that sound, but he was very interested in farming. Among the occupations of women in the church were nurses and seamstresses and grocers. And one member, Mary Morris, was described by Robinson as the servant of the church, and she obviously had quite an important role in serving in different ways, sort of like a deaconess, perhaps. Robinson also, I think, from his Methodist background in that early period, set up Methodist style classes. You know, the Methodist classes, they're the small groups that people gather in. And this included for children. He set up these classes for children as well as for adults. He was very, very keen on what at that time was called open communion. And this was quite a source of debate within Baptist life. Is everyone welcome to the Lord's table, or is it only those who were baptized as believers? And Robinson argued very strongly for open communion, or free communion, he sometimes called it. And really this was in line with his ideas about toleration, which I'll come back to a bit. And when he was advocating and arguing for the open or free communion, he pictured a closed communion church, and he pictured some named great Christian men and women of the past all coming along to this church and being refused communion. So it was quite a vivid sort of picture to make his point about the need to welcome all believers. And sometimes, on some occasions at least, those who had been baptized as infants but not as adult believers became members of the church. So this was the style of church that he was committed to. But one shouldn't imagine that this was just a free-for-all. Those who wanted to become members were interviewed, and their testimonies were heard. So he did want to go back to something I mentioned before, the covenant idea, the committed idea, that people were not just around the church. He wanted them to be a very, very living body, wanted the church to be a living body. I tried to find some cases of church discipline in the church minutes, and this is a period when Baptist churches were pretty keen on church discipline, but it doesn't appear very much in the records of St. Andrew Street, as I'll call it. And it certainly comes over as you read through these decades of Robinson's time, that it was a harmonious fellowship. There was one interesting occasion. A woman was accused of immoral conduct, and this was often the kind of case of church discipline. And two deacons were set the task of investigating, and reported that they had looked at all the evidence and the woman was innocent. And Robinson took the opportunity to warn about the danger of trying to fix things on people and to be judgmental in that way and impugn one another's characters, as he put it. So I think this leads on to my next point, which is to try and get a feel of Robinson as a pastor and preacher, and in this kind of tradition that we're familiar with from the Anabaptist way of thinking. And one of the things that Robinson wanted to do was to reach out to different groups of people, and he could see that the needs of the university sector were a bit different, and so he set up some extra meetings that he wanted to attract students and gown as well as town, as it's sometimes said in Cambridge. And it's clear again from the records that several people who were quite different from this group of people that I mentioned before were gradually drawn in: lawyers, school teachers, business people, and indeed a university professor of music called John Randall. But sadly, I haven't been able to find any family connection. Of course, I should say that the dissenters were barred from graduating from the university in this period. So it was quite a controversial thing for anybody from the university to attend a dissenting and nonconformist church. But quite a few students began to attend. Some of them were really taken by Robinson's preaching. Others interrupted the services. They felt that these dissenters should be taught a lesson. And in one of his sermons, Robinson preached specifically a satirical sermon about the behavior of the students. And this was a published sermon later. And some of this satire, I think, was something he quite enjoyed. He discussed in the sermon one of the scientific questions of the time, which he was very interested in. And this was the question of, is there a vacuum in nature? And he said, we need to pursue more investigation into this. But he said, there's certainly a vacuum in the brains of some of these students that are coming in and causing problems in our public worship. One of the descriptions of Robinson's usual style of preaching was that it was conversational more than oratorical, that he was reasoning from the scriptures and persuading, and it also says delighting. So I think there was a lot of all-round gifting within his preaching. He also was an advocate of lively hymn singing, and of course you'll know from the evangelical revival and the Wesleyan side of that in particular how important hymn singing was. And Robinson composed some hymns himself, and he believed that this for the dissenting churches especially was a very important way to express their faith. So one of the hymns he wrote was Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. And it's not one that I'm aware we're singing these days, but it's got some rather powerful words. Come Thou, and very much the evangelical revival. Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. Tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing. Call for songs of loudest praise. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He, to rescue me from danger, interposed his precious blood. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, O take and seal it for thy courts above. And that might seem quite individualistic, but you have to put it in the context of this strong stress on the church as a shared community. Just to give you an example of a sermon that he preached often on contemporary issues, as well as, of course, overall drawing from scripture. But this is a sermon entitled Slavery Inconsistent with the Spirit of Christianity. And I'll come back to this because it touches on the political side. But here's some quotes from that sermon. He says, slavery is contrary to the whole spirit, and just imagine this is being preached in a church, in his church. Slavery is contrary to the whole spirit and genius of the Christian religion. Slavery in every form is unjust and inhuman. A Christian religion in coalition with slavery is a mere creature of fantasy, for it is not credible that reasons for enslaving mankind are recommended by a book, the Bible, in praise of redemption. A faith that teaches the dignity of man, the fatherhood of God, the need of holiness and mercy, is necessarily hostile to the iniquitous traffic in human beings and its degradation of men into beasts. Do we have children? Let us set before them the sad but instructive histories of consciences oppressed, property plundered, families divided, and flourishing states ruined by exercises of arbitrary power. let us pass on the doctrine of Jesus, that God sent his son not to destroy men's lives, but to save them. So I hope you just get a little bit of a picture of the passion with which he preached on contemporary issues, as well as preaching in Cambridge itself, in his own church. He visited many of the villages around. He would sometimes preach at 5 o'clock in the morning before the farmers went out to work, or in the evening after they came back. And some of these sermons in the villages were published. I've read them, and he became known in some quarters as the Bishop of the Barns and the Fields. And often in different places where there were rivers, there would be baptismal services take place. And I've got one picture here amongst my very meager offering of pictures. But I hope you can see that's in the village of Whittlesford, and that's just a scene of people being baptized in the river. And that was, Robinson was involved in those kinds of baptisms. So now my last couple of sections, Robinson on the Anabaptists. By the 1780s, this was later on in his ministry, he was known for his writing and was being asked to do even more writing. And through university friends, he was able to borrow books for research. He always was a voracious reader. And he said, I've had loads and loads of books from the university, and I must have loads more. And amongst his writings was the book on what he called baptism, which was a history. And in it, he wrote about the Anabaptists. So just one or two things about what he said on that part of the history. It was a history of baptism going right through the centuries. But on the Anabaptists, he said, he spoke about other people who had written about them, and said, indiscriminately, without definition of terms or any distinction of times, places, persons, or circumstances, writers roll the narration of Anabaptism along and conclude without giving the reader any information. He says, there is not a plainer tale in the world than that of the Anabaptists, yet there is not a tale more confused in the telling. According to some who have done the Anabaptists the honor of writing their histories, that was a bit of sarcasm, I think, because they know nothing for certain, Anabaptism to them is a doleful tale of heresy and sedition. So for what can we say then? For Robinson, Anabaptism and Baptist views were related very closely together, related to civil liberty, and he spoke about some of the differences within the Anabaptist tradition. I would probably describe him as being more on the polygenesis side of Anabaptism, because he talked about the differences between the Dutch and the Swiss and the Moravians, who he said, of course, had more of a tendency to say that nobody should have an office of state and shouldn't take oaths or bear arms, but also some that were more inclined to say that you could be involved in government if you were an Anabaptist. So those are some of the issues that he raised and addressed. And this takes me to the last point, which is, I've called this Robinson as a campaigner. And I'll just concentrate in this short piece on his political campaigning. But he also campaigned for theological causes. He campaigned in defense of the historic faith of the Christian church. And some people have thought that his tendency towards toleration of all views meant that he didn't have strongly rooted views, but he certainly did. But the political side, I think, increased over time. And he wrote extensively about the need for universal liberty of conscience. And several of his published speeches in this period were in favor of the American Revolution and of political reform in Britain and against slavery, as we've seen. and some were addressed to Parliament. And this is really an indication of the national role of Robinson, that he was denounced at times in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords as a rather dangerous figure because of his concern for equality and liberty. So, of course, there were a number of campaigners, especially amongst the free churches in this time, but Robinson was probably one of the most outspoken, and he became known in America and was very pleased when George Washington's second in command came to visit him in Cambridge. He was really pro the independent United States that would emerge. So in his time in Cambridge in the ministry, there were several general elections, and none of them were contested in the first period of his ministry, and the Tories always had the seats for Cambridge. But Robinson became part, with other dissenters and one or two Anglicans, of putting up an anti-government candidate in the election in 1774. And this was something that Robinson gave quite a bit of energy to. The opposition was defeated, which is not surprising really, considering the constituency of the time, but it did lead on to other things. The fact that Robinson had done this started what was called a petition movement, and the petitions began to multiply, petitions to Parliament, opposing the warlike measures of the British government. That was one of the things that they contended for. And this was widely reported in local papers, and they even started a paper of themselves. And you see these themes being repeated in the papers. The war against, they were opposed to the war against America. They urged correction of abuses in the expenditure of public money, and they wanted the abolition of what was called sinecures. These gave well-paid jobs to those who were well-connected. Often they were highly paid civil service jobs, but people actually did nothing for the job. So this was a source of great offense to those looking for reform. And he actually helped to form a society in Cambridge, which met in the Black Bull Tavern. And this was a real forum for revolutionary ideas. And Robinson wrote about what happened in this. He said, I go there and I preach civil and religious liberty. And when tea comes along, I move to theology. I don't know quite why that would happen when the tea comes along, but anyway, that's what he said. But it's very important to see that for him, the theology and the political were absolutely intrinsically connected, and so was the nature of the church. So that's it. Robinson saw himself as being in this Anabaptist tradition, this free tradition. He was a pastor and a preacher of one particular church community, never moved to another, and a hymn writer, and his leadership built up the congregation, but also many other people, of course, contributed within his congregation. It was a diverse congregation, as I hope I've shown, and he loved that diversity. Each person was to be valued, and this was true in the church and true in society for him. Freedom was his watchword. His weakness, I think, was, probably more than one, but certainly one was that he tried to do too much. His various activities exhausted him, and before his death, I think it was his oldest daughter, Julia, died at the age of 17. And she was a very impressive young person, and I don't think he really recovered from that. He was inconsolable, and so he lost his will, and he died at the age of 54. But the congregation put this memorial to Robert Robinson. He was somebody of indefatigable industry, his inexhaustible variety of knowledge they spoke about, his eloquence, his conversation, his erudition, his boldness, and his virtues as a man and a Christian. Those were the people who had lived with him, and they wrote that about him as they remembered him. So that's my presentation of Robert Robinson, and back to you, Linda.